Psalm 36. This should be an interesting one, so we'll read through it. It's a little bit shorter than we have been, 12 verses instead of the 28 the last few have been. But we'll read through it, we'll discuss it, but before we do all those things, we'll have a word of prayer. I'm going to wait just a minute so as not to catch people in the middle of walking. I know I started early. It's my fault, not yours. It's mine. My father-in-law always says that if your bus is not on time, it's much better for it to be late than early, because you're more likely to miss it, of course, if it's too early. So early sometimes is worse than late, every once in a while. So, all right, we'll go ahead and we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll read and discuss. If you'd pray with me. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have the opportunity to sit with our brothers and sisters and to discuss the word that you have revealed to us, that you have given to us in these Psalms. We ask that you would bless us as we do so, give us wisdom and discernment that we may better understand you and your will for us, that we may understand how we can serve you with the lives that we lead. We are grateful, Father, for what you have done, for giving this to us, for affording us this among many other opportunities. We ask that you would continue to watch over us and to take care of us as you have done. And we thank you most of all, Father, for having the kindness and the compassion and the mercy to send your Son, Jesus, as a Redeemer to save us from our sins. We pray these things in Jesus' name. All right, so Psalm 36. Make sure there we are. For the chief musician of David, the servant of Yahweh. Transgression speaks to the wicked within his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes. For it causes him to be flattered in his own eyes, to find his own iniquity, to hate. The words of his mouth are iniquity and deceit. He has ceased to be wise, to do good. He devises iniquity upon his bed. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not abhor evil. O Yahweh, in the heavens is your loving kindness. Your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Your righteousness is like the mountains of God, your judgments the great deep. You preserve man and beast, O Yahweh. How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the sons of men in the shadow of your wings take refuge. They shall be watered with the fatness of your house, and of the river of your pleasures you will make them drink. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light shall we see light. Continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. Let not the foot of pride come against me, and let not the hand of the wicked drive me away. There we go. There have the workers of iniquity fallen. They are thrust down and shall not be able to rise. All right, so this is an interesting psalm. Before I get to my customary and usual opening question, which is to ask what this psalm is about, I will say that this is a difficult psalm for a number of reasons. Not necessarily theologically. It does not present us a problem or a thorny issue to deal with in terms of squaring it with the rest of the Bible or the kind of accepted orthodoxy that comes with the rest of the biblical text, but in understanding maybe precisely or concretely what is meant where and what direction this psalm is intending to go in different places. So given that, and the warning that it is a little tricky, what would you say upon looking at this psalm, reading through it, hearing it, what would you say this psalm is about? So there is a contrast drawn, right, between men and God. What kind of men? All men? Bad men, specifically, yes. The wicked. And that's what makes this. Now, some Bibles have a section that shows a slight offset or a gap between two portions of this psalm. And that is because you can really kind of break this psalm into three places, or maybe just two, but there's a real clear break between 1 and 4, right? The first 4 verses, and then 5 through 9, where the topic of the psalm and the direction of the psalm shifts significantly. It goes from speaking about the wicked and the way they behave and those actions right into what sounds much more like a hymn of praise to God. And while there is clearly, I would say, an intention to compare and contrast, there's not any real significant linkage between the two. Right? In a psalm of lament, you would have specific things that were happening, perhaps to the writer. And the writer would talk about those things, and then the writer would plead with God to aid him because of the qualities that God has, and then, again, usually conclude with that confident expectation that God is going to do so. Here, we don't really have that. We have a description of the wicked, but not really a sense that they are particularly oppressing the speaker directly. Speaking of them more generally. And then it speaks more generally as well of praise to God and praise of who God is and his attributes, before concluding with something of that prayer or that confidence in who God is and what will happen, what God will do. It is unusual, the structure of this song. So, yeah.
I'm sorry, a question probably applies to a lot of music. That said, it's for the choir director.
Mm-hmm.
Do they sing this?
Yes. I mean, the Book of Psalms is entirely songs. I mean, this is basically the meaning of psalm. And so they would all be sung by at least one person, most probably because of the way that they're collected into the Book of Psalms, right, which had to have been done well after most of them were written, right, because if you have 150 of them and there's indications in them that they were written over the span of a couple hundred years, they were probably used for corporate worship in the temple.
It's hard for me to imagine what kind of music would accompany this.
It is, yeah. Yeah, it is very difficult to put ourselves in that mindset of that kind of music. I'm not sure that they used, now music, this is kind of ironic for somebody who's teaching a class on Psalms. Music is not my strong suit, right? In my family, I am probably the least musical of everyone that's there. One of my younger brothers in particular is very annoying that he is very talented with music. He's the kind of guy that, he'll be like, oh, that's an interesting instrument, and he'll pick it up, fiddle with it for a minute, and then he'll start picking out a tune on it, and it's like, how do you do that? I don't understand this. But my understanding of the scales, right, the musical notes and scales that we have, they work on eighths, right? You have 8 notes, and has to do with wave harmonics and whatever. But other places, other cultures don't necessarily do that or haven't necessarily done that. And this is why, for example, probably most prominently to us, Indian music does not sound at all like the music we are used to. And because the basis of their musical system and their note system that they use is not actually based on the number 8 and the actual fitting in with that kind of wave, it's different. And so it sounds incredibly different to hear, and we don't really have that same ability to anticipate maybe where the notes will go, because it doesn't follow the patterns to which we're accustomed. And I would not be at all surprised if the original Hebrew music functioned in much the same way. Right? But we don't really have information about how the music was supposed to go with these words.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
There's also the matter of the language that was spoken when they sang it. It may not even be of the dialect that we know today. It could have been something that flowed much smoother and made a lot more sense.
Yes, that's an excellent point too. That even the language, the words themselves, right, the meter, right, the progression of how many syllables you have, wildly different than what we're getting in English. The sounds, they didn't use rhyme. We've talked about this before. They didn't like rhyme the way that we like rhyme for poetry, right? They were much more like in tune with what the Old English poems were like, with alliteration. The first sound of words sounding the same was the way they liked their poetry. So it would have been a very different kind of experience, yeah. All right, I'm going to move on here. Wicked men contrasted with the loving God. In the first verse, we have the Greek translation of this in the Septuagint, which generally says something like this: transgression speaks to the wicked within his heart. Now, some of you are going to have translations that don't say that quite that information. And one of the key features here is the word speaks. It is also the same word for oracle, right? Or a prophecy or a divine inspired word from God. And so you can read this a different way. An oracle concerning the transgression of the wicked is in my heart. This is the Hebrew or the Masoretic text reading. The other big difference to this is the my and the his. It can be a problem to read this with my, speaking of the wickedness or the knowledge of the wicked within my heart, and still understand this as being written by the psalmist. And it's the way that apparently the Greek translators originally got over this, was to shift that from mine to his. The English Standard Version, the American Standard Version, most versions, it's not 90-10, but it is more than 50% of the English translations I looked up, use in favor of the his reading. But interestingly, the King James and the NIV notably stick with my, which is from the Hebrew, rather than the Greek version of the Old Testament, and is the one that is a little bit more difficult. But I think it does make sense. I've read several commentators that say that they don't really see why you need to change it. It could be that the writer is saying that he has received or has been given knowledge of how the wicked think and operate, and is speaking about that as a warning, as a informational service, I guess you could say, to those who seek to understand why the hearts of men are corrupt and evil. But you'll see in different versions, and again, as I say, in several prominent versions that are frequently used, a difference between the his and the my, and then whether or not the word is translated as simply speaking about something or as a divine kind of inspired prophecy, an oracle from God. The word can go both ways depending on context, and here the context, unfortunately, is a little bit less than clear. So I want to gloss over that too quickly, but the word transgression also should take on a bit more of the note of rebellion. What does transgression actually mean in English? I'm sorry?
To go against.
To go against, yep. The literal word comes originally to go against or to violate a boundary of some kind. It simply means to cross a boundary. You step over the line. And so in English, we can have a much more passive sense of that word, right? I did it out of ignorance. I didn't know where the line was. I made a mistake. But the Hebrew sense of this word is much more of an active rebelling one. And so when we read transgression, it's important to kind of take on or to remember that this is a deliberate choice on the part of the person who is doing this. Again, this is the reading or the sense that's trying to be conveyed by the author. And then we have, for it causes, at least in the translation I'm using here for verse 2. What is he trying to say? We have the first part. I'll read it again. Transgression speaks to the wicked within his heart. There is no fear of God before his eyes, for it causes him to be flattered in his own eyes, to find his own iniquity to hate. What causes him? What is the impetus of this that causes him to do these things? It's the lack of fear of God, yeah. It would be easy to kind of read that a little too simplistically, that it is the fear of God that does that, but it is the negative idea. The lack of fear in God causes the wicked to behave in these ways, right? What is the beginning of all wisdom, the Bible tells us? The fear of God, right? The knowledge of who God is and reverence for him and his position, the fear, the proper and appropriate fear of the creator of the universe is what leads us down the path of wisdom and keeps us in the way of righteousness. And when that is gone, we begin to diverge. Yes, ma'am?
Well, we see that today. People have no fear of God. They don't even acknowledge God.
Mm-hmm.
It's just some dementia man that, maybe could be a good man. That's against what God teaches. That's against what we as Christians believe. And so it's difficult.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, not to be too self-referential, but when we talk about Ecclesiastes, right, this has always been the way, right? That we see that is the way things are now, that the wider world and most people do not properly and as much as they should fear and reverence the Lord. We see that the psalmist is talking about it here. We can look at other places. Jesus deals with that, right, with the Pharisees in the Gospels, that it's hundreds of years after these psalms were written, or maybe 1,000, depending on when you date this. But you look back further, right? These psalms tend to come from the period of the kings. You look at the beginning of Judges. What does the beginning of Judges open with? In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. It's been a problem. It has always been a problem. And as Ecclesiastes teaches us, if something has been, it will be again and will never truly go away. There's nothing new under the sun. We will always deal with this problem. Our grandparents had it, we have it, and our grandchildren will deal with it too. Right? We are not going to solve the world's problems. The only solution to the world's problems is God and his son Jesus, and not everyone will accept it. Now, until he comes again and the world is remade, there's no fixing things in a permanent way. Anyway, all right, get a lot of topic there. Tend to chase rabbits. Yeah, the wicked's lack of fear makes them smooth over their wickedness. The word here for flattery is literally the word for smooth. You can think of it almost as sanding down the rough edges, right? They're smoothing out the wrinkles that exist within their conduct, making things appear better than they are, or to ignore the things that ought to bother them, right? It's to me, anyway, it's a powerful metaphor, that idea of something that bothers you, it sticks up, you prick your finger on it every time it comes up, figuratively, that this conduct or this behavior should trouble you. It should spur your conscience to change your behavior. But the wicked make a deliberate effort to smooth it out, cover it down, push it down so it does not trouble them. They callous their own conscience. Because otherwise they would have to confront their own sinfulness and hate it, which is the end of this verse. Otherwise, to find his own iniquity, to hate. There's a lot of this that is implied because these verbs are used in their infinitive form, which is why the summary translation that you get more out of the ASV, more literal, I should say, translation you get out of the ASV, doesn't have the rest of that verbiage around it. In the NIV, for his own eyes, he flatters himself too much to detect or hate his sin. And the idea is that you don't want to confront the things you have done wrong. You smooth it out, you pass over it, you cover it up in your own mind. And this is a propensity that we all have. Right? When we do wrong things, we don't necessarily like to be confronted with them. That is an uncomfortable moment, to face up to a deliberately poor choice that we have made, to apologize to a person that we have hurt or offended, to accept that, yeah, I did something I ought not to have done. It's not pleasant. It shouldn't be pleasant, right? It is part of that spur to get us to change, is the discomfort that it makes us feel.
It's like when you lay an egg, sit on it.
I've not heard that phrase, but that's a good one, yes. Verse 3 becomes the next stage after our own self-deception. In describing the wicked, we deceive ourselves first, and then we deceive others. We deceive ourselves about our own intentions, about the justification for our own actions. We smooth it out in our own mind. And then we can start moving on to doing this about others. The words of his mouth are iniquity and deceit. He has ceased to be wise to do good. The things that we begin to say to others are full of wickedness. They are full of lies. We begin to manipulate others to get what we want. We do bad things publicly, deceitfully. The wicked man deceives himself and then others. The second half of this is speaking of wisdom. It ceasing to be wise and to do good. These two ideas go along hand in hand in the Bible, that to be wise is to do good, and that doing good is the wise choice of action. In this particular case, you can kind of look at this in the manner that it's shown in Isaiah 52, specifically verse 13. But in this passage, it's speaking of the man of sorrows, the man who will suffer, and the prophecy of the coming of Jesus. And he is one who acts in the path of wisdom, who follows wisdom. It speaks of the same idea in a positive way, that one who is wise or follows that still ends up suffering. How then is it the right and good path if being wise and doing these things still leads us to a life of pain? What is the author trying to say? What does this concept mean for them? If being wise and having a good life still leads to a life where you suffer. Yeah.
Because there's something else to look forward to past that.
Yeah, because we are right with God, and God will, whether now or in the future, reward, care, and take and embrace those who follow and love him. We are warned as Christians that when we follow in the path of Christ, we are taking up our cross. We are taking on the willingness to suffer because of the expectation of future things, and as well, importantly, because it is right. It is the correct path. And the virtues or the rewards that it has are not always immediate, but they are also not temporary. The rewards of the wicked may be immediate, but they are also temporary. They will not endure. And then finally, the wicked man is described as being consumed by his wickedness. He devises iniquity upon his bed. What does he mean by that? He devises iniquity upon his bed.
He dreams of that kind of activity?
He's dreaming of it at night. He's thinking of it all the time. When he's up and about and out and about, and at night when he goes and like that, it is the thing that it consumes and takes over his life. Yeah. Yeah, he's dwelling on it all the time. It's interesting, the phrase that's used after this. He sets himself in a way that is not good. He does not abhor evil. I really like that word, abhor. It's a very rare construction in English to put an H after a B. We don't normally use that consonantal sound, but abhor is one of the few places that we do. The word in Hebrews here is closer to reject. He does not reject evil. And the sense of this seems to be, interestingly, that it is not necessary for him to want to hurt people. It's not necessary for him to devise plans that cause others problems. Wickedness also encompasses just not caring about what happens to other people. He doesn't reject it. He forms a plan for his own benefit, and we're not worrying about the collateral damage. Who gets hurt in the process? Who I have to step on to get there? The sense of this verse is to tell us that we don't just have to plan to deliberately harm someone, to take what they have, or to punish them in some way that they don't deserve. Our wickedness can encompass not being sufficiently concerned with the outcomes of our actions. I'm going to get mine, and if that means I have to hurt you, then well, so be it. That's not my intention to hurt you, maybe in this process. I just don't care. That too is part of the wickedness that we finally fall into. Again, this idea of smoothing over the conscience, the scarring, the callousing of our feelings for others so that we can no longer be affected by their suffering. Even if it's not our goal, it doesn't bother us. I mean, we see this sometimes in popular literature and movies and things. People equate the idea of hate as being closely related to the emotion of love. Why?
Say that again?
People will often talk about the emotion, the feeling of hate for someone as being close to the feeling of love for a person. But why do we do that? Why is that a popular literary kind of idea and trope? Yeah.
Because you're still thinking about it.
You're deeply invested in what happens to the other person. Sometimes complete and utter disdain is a bigger crime. There's a line, a magnificent line in the movie Casablanca, one of my favorite ones, near the beginning. I'm not spoiling anything. If you have, it's 80 years old. You should have seen this movie. Anyway, one of the characters comes up to Humphrey Bogart, and after talking to him for a minute, he says, "You despise me, don't you?" And he looks at him with this cold expression on his face, and he says, "I suppose if I gave you any thought, I would." His disdain is such that he doesn't think about it. I never watched the show, but there's a popular meme I see online from Mad Men. The same idea, right? Where it's like, I don't even think about you. You don't even cross my thoughts. And that kind of uncaringness for others can be its own form of deep, deep wickedness. Yes?
Another movie reference, there is no us.
Yeah. It's an idea that we see that sometimes that refusal to even think or care can be worse in some ways than antagonism.
Johnny Cash said that about one of his son-in-laws, and he didn't know him well enough to dislike him.
Yeah, there's plenty of very quotable people on this sort of topic. One of the former, we're getting sidetracked. That's okay. One of the former prime ministers of Israel, Golda Meir, famously said to someone, "Don't be so humble, you're not that great." Which I always thought was a great way of putting it too. But yes, the idea of disdain or simply not caring as a form of the wickedness that we will eventually reach. Just what I was saying a second ago. So, from this point, we'll see how much of this we can get through before we run out of time. There's a shift, an abrupt shift. As I say, in my particular text here, I even have a slight break between paragraphs in the middle of the psalm, because this feels like a very different section. 5 shifts with almost no transition to praise of God. It just shifts almost immediately. It doesn't seem to be related directly to the topic ahead. It is simply presented as a different subject, taken up abruptly. In the first verse, "O Yahweh, in the heavens is your loving kindness, your faithfulness reaches to the skies." The concepts of faithfulness and loving kindness, sometimes you'll see this translated as loyal love, very often go hand in hand. Why would these two ideas go hand in hand textually in the Bible? Frequently they are paired within a verse or a set of verses. Yeah.
Saying the same thing.
They're saying a very similar sort of thing. Yes. That the love that God has for us is one that is faithful and that endures. And it speaks to the covenantal relationship, particularly in the Old Testament, between the people of God and God. That there were promises made, right? A pact or a covenant made on both sides. That the people of God, the Israelites, would obey and they would follow and worship Him, not turn away and worship false gods. They would follow the law. In return, God would be their God. He would protect them and care for them and love them, bless them, send them the various things that they required and needed at any point in time. And the author here is saying that indeed that is who God is. It's not just simply that is who God is in a small way. He emphasizes the degree to which this is. Where is His loving kindness? It is in the heavens. Where does His faithfulness go? It reaches to the skies. And again, in a poetic sense, especially for people of this time and this place, what does the idea of something that is that high mean? It can't be reached. It can't be gotten over. It can't be worked around. It cannot be surpassed. Right? They were an earthbound people. Right? And we still have that to some degree. Like, I'm never going to the moon. That's just not going to happen. Right? I'm not going to visit another planet. That will not happen to me in my lifetime. And this idea of something stretching to the heavens, reaching as far as the skies, is something that is too big for me to be able to deal with on my own. And when it is something positive, it is something that no one can take away. No one can take us away from God. Right? This idea is revisited by Paul in the Gospels. No one can take us out of the hand of God. There is no power on earth or outside of the earth or anything that can separate us from the love of God. Right? Same sort of, or similar sort of concept. And I just talk about my next note before I get there. All right. But why then, in the next verse, does he choose height for righteousness and depth for judgment? Your righteousness is like the mountains of God, your judgments the great deep.
We have an expression, deep thinker.
Okay. A deep thinker. What is a deep thinker?
Somebody who investigates every aspect of the concept.
Yeah. Someone who goes into things very, very thoroughly. But are we able to fully understand the mind of God? No. We use a metaphor for depth, for an ability or inability to understand, don't we? Even in English. The word fathom. Fathom is a specific measurement of depth. I think it's 6 feet. It's a traditional nautical measurement of depth, at any rate. And when we say something, we just can't fathom it, means we can't understand it. We can't fully understand or comprehend it. We cannot find the bottom of the matter. We can't fully search it out. The judgments of God are things that we are not fully able to comprehend or understand, but we know that we trust in them and because of who he is and what he's able to do. And in the same way, speaking of his righteousness, it cannot be overcome. Height versus depth. He's using these metaphors to express the magnitude of God in some way. Even though, again, can we fully express the magnitude of an infinite God? No, we can't. These metaphors are trying to give us some sense of how far God surpasses us and who we are in relationship to him. There is also perhaps, you can take this or reject it as you like, an allusion to Noah. Speaking of the deep, in the story of Noah, it talks about the fountains of the deep being part of the flood. And then in the next line here, you preserve man and beast, O Yahweh, God saving men and animals. It fits in, perhaps, with the general theme of who God is. God's greatness, God's righteousness, God's loving kindness towards us, his faithfulness to those who are faithful to him, all things that are part of the story of Noah. It is a little bit more of a stretch, certainly in terms of it's not explicit here, but we are dealing with a poetic form. And whether or not the author necessarily intended for us to do that, the story certainly fits or matches. So you don't necessarily have to believe that the psalmist meant that when he wrote it, but I think it's an apt comparison nonetheless. So. The loving kindness of God is valuable because it offers us safety. He speaks of the safety here next. How precious is your loving kindness, O God, and the sons of men in the shadows of your wings take refuge. Does that remind anyone of anything? That verse? Bring any other verses or passages to mind? Cleft of the rock? Okay. Was it hide my soul in the cleft of the rock? Yeah. I was thinking, in fact, of the instance of the zoomorphism, right? Comparing God to an animal or using an animal trait to kind of describe how God does this. It's not as common as some of the other ones. We much more often anthropomorphize attributes of God, talking about his hands or his eyes, things like that he does not possess, being spirit. But in Matthew 23:37, Jesus speaks to Jerusalem, saying, referring to himself, as if he were a mother hen who has longed to gather her chicks under her wings. That same idea of protection, of security, and the idea that we have that available, right? God wants to do this for us. God wishes to protect us, to give us what is beneficial, to defend us. But we don't always accept that, right? There are the people of Jerusalem, the Pharisees and the others that reject Jesus and his gospel, who will not seek that refuge, will not go under the shadow of those wings. Yeah. Yes, sir.
In fact, the New American Standard Version says, children of men take refuge in the shadow of your wings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he uses that specific shadow of the wings reference here in this psalm, and again, the same one, very similar one. There's a little more detail when Jesus uses it, but it's the exact same idea. Yeah. I really, mixed metaphors. What a delight. Seems like a mix of metaphors here in 8. They will be watered with the fatness of your house. What on earth does this mean? What on earth does it mean? Abundance, certainly. Fatness is a term for abundance or that which is most beneficial. Yeah, that's what that is. But why watered? Yeah, exactly. It's life, nourished. We are given life by the largesse, by the goodness and greatness of God. Yeah, this is what we do with plants. The idea of gardening or farming, again, particularly in the place that they are, where it could have very dry and arid seasons, the idea of giving water is an idea of giving and providing life. It is a very powerful metaphor to anybody that lives in a place where you depend on wells and you have deserts and droughts and things like that. Yeah. He continues this idea here. I think I talked about this in the next one, but he talks about the river of pleasures. This appears to be an allusion actually to Eden. The idea that Eden, the place of God's favor, when we are dwelling in the place that God wants us to be, is a place of perfection and delight. And that, again, the idea of a river and water is the idea of life, giving of life that we have. I see children going by and coming in, so it means I am probably running short on time. Okay, yeah, well, let's see. Water is metaphor for life. This is a spiritual and physical metaphor as well that you see in the Gospels. Particularly, I don't know, was it last week? Oh, my memory. One of the sermons that Dennis was giving, right? He talks about the Samaritan woman at the well, and that difficulty maybe in bridging that gap of understanding, but the use of the idea of water, giving water, living water for spiritual life in the same way that regular water provides the life of physical life. All right, well, I didn't not quite through, but I don't want to. 9 sums up this hymn passage, that only in God that we have these things. So, turn the page here. In your light shall we see light. And this is reminiscent of John, right? That the Word was the light that came into the world did not accept or understand it. And that light is also an element of life. This goes back to the idea of creation. When God creates life, the first thing that he creates before creating life in this world is to create light, to light it first, and then gives form to all the things that will inhabit his creation. All right, kind of sped up there a little bit at the end. Questions, comments, things that I zipped past that you were like, no, wait, talk about this more. Complaints? Actually, my favorite complaint. I normally try not to leave time, but I got like 1 minute. No? All right, well, you missed your shot. Next week, maybe. We will talk about Psalm 37. I appreciate everybody's time and attention today, and I'm sorry we didn't quite get to the last couple verses there. Thank you very much.